I'm writing this the way you write something you don't want anyone to find. Not because it's shameful. Not because it's illegal. Because once it's read, it doesn't stay read. It stays present. It becomes a thing that stands in the room with you, just out of the corner of your eye, and you'll start noticing the quiet parts of your life more than you ever did before. If you're holding this, it means someone either went looking for it, or it got loose on its own. I've lost track of which objects are mine and which ones only pretend they are. My badge has been missing for 3 days. My belt is hanging where it always hangs. The radio on my kitchen counter still has battery in it, even though I haven't changed them in months. It makes a soft click every so often, like it's trying to remember what it's for. I'm a patrol officer. Detroit. 3rd Precinct. Until they moved the lines and nobody called it that anymore. I've been on nights for most of my career. I know the city the way you know a house you grew up in. I know which boards creak, which stairs sag, which doors stick in winter. I know the streets that swallow sound. I know the ones that bounce it back. I didn't believe in anything you couldn't write on a report. I believed in weather, in deadlines, in shift change, in calling your partner before you step into something that feels wrong. I believed in the usual things that keep you alive: light, distance, and the habit of not getting sentimental. And then I found a man standing perfectly still in a frozen alley. That sentence looks ridiculous, flat on a page, like it should end with a punchline or a cautionary lecture. But it doesn't. It just sits there. It sits the way he stood. I've tried saying it out loud, in different rooms, different times of day. In my bedroom with the blinds closed. In the locker room at the precinct with other guys talking too loud. In my car with the heater blowing stale air onto my hands. The words always come out the same, and then there's a pause afterwards that doesn't belong to the room I'm in. There are details I can still keep straight. I cling to those because the rest slips. The rest rearranges itself when I'm not watching. So I'll tell it as clean as I can, like an incident report. But you need to understand that clean isn't the same as true. Sometimes clean is just a way of hiding the mess. It was January. That part matters. It was the kind of cold that makes the city feel hollow. The kind that turns breath into something you can see and then forget about. Because you have to. Snow had come down earlier and then stopped. Not a storm. Not enough to shut anything down. Just a soft layer that caught on the edges of things. On broken glass and fire escapes. And the shoulders of abandoned cars. The streets were quiet in that way they get quiet when the cold convinces people to stay inside, even if they don't have much of an inside to stay in. On nights like that, the radio sounds different. Fewer calls. The same voices. You hear people's fatigue in the way they say their unit numbers. You hear the hesitation before they confirm they're en route. There was a call that came in a little after 2. It didn't have the usual shape to it. Most calls do. You get used to the rhythm. Somebody called. Somebody saw something. Somebody wants somebody else to do something about it. This one was a location and a sentence that didn't sit right in the dispatcher's mouth. A man standing in an alley. That was it. No screaming. No weapon mentioned. No, he's threatening me. No, he's bleeding. No, he's breaking into something. Just standing. And an alley, which narrows the city down to a corridor where your body knows it shouldn't relax. The dispatcher read it the way they read anything else, because that's how you stay sane. But I heard something small underneath it, like she expected me to laugh, or like she hoped I would, so it would become nothing. I didn't laugh. I said I was close. I was, in a way that later felt like it had been arranged. I was already in the area because the night had been slow, and I'd been cruising the border streets, the ones where the streetlights thin out and the buildings stop being lived in and start being waited out. The alley was behind a row of old storefronts, boarded, tagged, the kind of place people use as a shortcut even when they shouldn't. I knew it. Everybody on nights knew it. There was a legend about it. The kind of half-joke that gets passed along in roll call when someone wants to spook the rookies. They called it the listening alley. Nobody could ever tell you who started calling it that. It had no official name, no sign. Just an in-between place behind an old bakery that had shut down years ago. But the older guys had a way of saying it, like it was a thing you weren't supposed to name too loud. Listening alley. Like the alley had ears. Like the walls had learned something. I'd heard the stories. A few missing persons over the years, always in winter, always late. A couple of calls about someone seeing a figure standing back there, still as a post. And then nobody there when the unit arrived. An officer decades ago who supposedly quit after a night behind the bakery, left his badge on the captain's desk, and never came back. That last one was the kind of story you roll your eyes at and still remember. I turned into the block with the bakery and slowed down. The street was empty. My headlights washed over the brick and the plywood, and the white crust of snow along the curb. The sky looked low, like it was pressing down. My tires made the only sound that mattered. I parked just past the mouth of the alley. I left the engine running. The heater was going full blast, and it still didn't feel like warmth. It felt like pretending. I sat there for a second with my hands on the wheel. People don't talk about that part of the job much. The part where you wait before you get out. It's not fear, most of the time. It's calculation. It's your brain running through all the shapes a call can take. It's your body remembering other nights. It's the quiet moment where you decide whether you're going to be the kind of cop who steps into the dark without thinking, or the kind who listens to the small alarm that goes off in your chest. That night, the alarm was steady. Not loud. Just there. Not real. Real. Not real. I didn't say that phrase then. I hadn't learned it yet, but the feeling was already working its way into me. The contradiction that doesn't resolve. The sense that something can be ordinary and wrong at the same time. I keyed my mic, told dispatch I was on scene. My own voice sounded too crisp in the quiet. The reply came back. Routine. She asked if I needed a second unit. I said no. Not because I was brave, but because the call didn't justify it, and you don't pull someone from their area for a man standing still. That's what I told myself. I got out. The cold hit my face like a hand. The air tasted like metal and old smoke. My boots sank slightly into the snow and made a sound that felt huge. The alley was a narrow slit between buildings. The snow back there was undisturbed except for a few scattered prints near the entrance, half filled in, like they'd been waiting. I stopped at the mouth and let my eyes adjust. My flashlight beam cut a pale tunnel through the dark. The walls on either side were brick, damp, frosted in places. Trash bags frozen into shape. A shopping cart on its side, rimmed with ice, a smell of old flour and rot, and something else that wasn't a smell so much as a memory of a smell. I took a few steps in. The silence changed. People think silence is just the absence of sound. That's not true. There are different kinds of quiet. There's the quiet of snow on a normal street, muffling the world. There's the quiet of an empty building, full of little settling noises and distant city hum. There's the quiet you get when your ears are ringing after a loud noise. This was another kind. This was quiet that felt occupied. As I moved deeper, my flashlight beam picked up the end wall, the back of the bakery. A flat expanse of brick with a metal door set into it, chained shut long ago. The beam also picked up a shape in the middle of the alley, standing a few feet from that wall. At first it didn't register as a person. It looked like a post, like some leftover construction marker. Then my brain did what it always does. and sorted it into human. A man. Standing upright. Facing the brick wall. Hands at his sides. No movement. The distance between us wasn't far. 20 yards, maybe less. Close enough that I should have seen his breath. Close enough that I should have heard something. A shuffle. A cough. The small sounds people make when they're alive and standing out in winter. But there was nothing. I called out. The usual. Sir. Police. Are you okay? My voice echoed once off the brick and then died. He didn't turn. He didn't react. The beam of my flashlight landed on his back. A dark coat. Too thin for the weather. Shoulders squared. The outline of his head. Hair maybe, or a hood. It was hard to tell with the way the light flattened everything. I took a step closer. My boot crunch sounded obscene. I said it again. Louder. Sir. Hey. Nothing. I reached for my radio, pressed the talk button, and for a second I heard nothing but static. A deep, thick static. Like the channel was full of snow, too. Then dispatch came through faintly. Like she was speaking from another room. I told her I had contact. Possible welfare check. My words came out clipped, the way they do when you're trying not to let uncertainty creep in. I took another step, and that's when I saw the frost. It wasn't on the ground around him. It wasn't on his shoulders like fresh snow. It was on him in the wrong way, clinging to the edges of his coat, the seams, the outline of his arms, like he'd been there long enough for the air itself to settle onto him and harden. My flashlight beam caught the side of his face just enough for me to see his profile. His eyes were open, and he still wasn't moving. Not real. Real. Not real. I didn't know the phrase yet, but my mind was already trying to split the moment into pieces it could handle. A drunk. A junkie. A guy trying to mess with police. A man in shock. A statue. A trick of light. Anything that let me step forward without stepping into something I couldn't write down later. I raised my free hand, palm out, like I was approaching a skittish animal. Sir. Can you hear me? The man did something then. Not a turn, not a flinch, not a step. He breathed. Once. A deep inhale that moved his shoulders just slightly, slow and deliberate, like he'd been waiting to do it until I was close enough to notice. The air around his mouth didn't fog the way it should have, but I heard it. I heard it, because the alley was listening too. And then, he went still again, so still that the cold seemed to tighten around him. So still that my own breathing sounded like an intrusion. That was the first time I felt it, the sense that I had arrived late to something already happening, and that whatever was standing in front of me had been there long before the call came in. I didn't touch him. That's the first thing I need to get straight, because the memory keeps trying to rewrite itself. There are versions where my glove brushes his sleeve. Versions where I grab his shoulder and feel something wrong underneath the fabric. Versions where my hand freezes in midair and won't obey me. Those are later versions. They don't belong here. In this part, I didn't touch him. I stood there with my arm half raised, palm open, the way they teach you to do when you don't know what you're walking into. The cold had worked its way through my coat and into my chest, making every breath feel shallow and deliberate. The man stood in front of me, facing the brick wall, his breath already spent, his stillness heavy enough to feel like pressure. I waited for something to happen. Nothing did. I remember thinking, very calmly, that this was how people died in the cold. Standing up, falling asleep without knowing they were doing it. I'd seen it before, not often, but enough to recognize the posture. enough to know the look of a body that had decided, quietly, to stop arguing with the weather. But those bodies slumped. They leaned. They sagged. They folded inward like they were apologizing for taking up space. This man didn't. He stood straight, balanced, as if the ground itself was holding him there. I told myself to move. I told myself that standing still too long in a place like that was how you let your imagination get ahead of you. I took another step forward, slow, careful not to slip. My flashlight beam wavered and then steadied on the back of his head. His hair, what I could see of it, was dusted with frost. Not snow. Frost. The kind that creeps and clings. It traced the line of his ear. It settled in the shallow places where skin meets air. I leaned slightly to one side, trying to see his face more clearly without stepping fully into his space. His profile was sharp in the light. Nose. Cheek. Lips parted just enough to suggest another breath might come. It didn't. I spoke again, quieter this time, without meaning to be. My voice sounded wrong to my own ears, like it didn't belong to me anymore. Sir. The word hung there and fell. I keyed my radio again, thumb stiff with cold. For a moment, there was only that deep static, thicker than before, as if the channel was clogged. Then the dispatcher's voice pushed through, faint and warped. Unit 12, say again. I told her I had a male subject, unresponsive, standing. I didn't say perfectly still. I didn't say frozen. I didn't say anything that would make it sound like more than a routine welfare check, gone quiet. As I spoke, I realized something else. The alley didn't smell right. It wasn't the usual mix of garbage and damp brick and old grease. There was that, underneath. But layered on top of it was something flat and stale, like air that had been sealed in a container too long, like the inside of a freezer that had been unplugged and forgotten. I shifted my weight, trying to keep circulation in my feet. The snow beneath me crunched softly. The man didn't react. I circled him, slow, keeping a careful distance. Each step felt louder than it should have. My flashlight beam traced his outline, caught on the folds of his coat, the stiff fabric at his elbows. There were no visible injuries. No blood, no sign of struggle. His hands hung at his sides, fingers slightly curled, skin pale and dry. Frost had gathered there too in the creases of his knuckles, along the backs of his hands. It looked decorative, almost intentional. I stopped where I could see his face fully. His eyes were open, unfocused, fixed on the brick wall inches from his nose. The wall itself was worn smooth in one small area. The bricks dulled and lightened, as if something had been standing there for a long time, close enough to erase the texture. I didn't think about that then. I couldn't afford to. My brain was busy sorting, labeling, looking for the right box to put this in. Not real. Real. Not real. I reached out again, slower this time, my glove hovering near his sleeve. I wanted to feel warmth or cold, or anything that would settle the question of whether he was alive in a way that made sense. Before I made contact, the radio crackled sharply, loud enough to make me flinch. The sound echoed off the brick walls and seemed to multiply, bouncing back on itself. Unit 12, backup is en route. I hadn't asked for backup. I couldn't remember deciding not to ask. The dispatcher sounded strained now, like she was reading something she didn't like. I acknowledged, kept my eyes on the man, my hand lowered, unfinished. I waited. The alley stayed quiet, but it wasn't empty anymore. I had the distinct sense that something had shifted, like the moment when a room fills with people, and you don't hear them come in. But suddenly, the air feels used. The man breathed again. Just once. It was closer this time. I was sure of it. Close enough that I could hear the faint rasp at the back of his throat. Close enough that I felt it in my chest, a sympathetic tightening, as if my lungs were trying to match him. Then stillness again. I took a step back without meaning to. My heel slid slightly on the snow, and I caught myself. Heart thudding too fast. The man didn't sway, didn't adjust, didn't acknowledge gravity or balance or anything else that keeps people upright. I told myself he was in shock. Hypothermia can do strange things. People get confused. People lose sensation. People behave unpredictably. But unpredictability implies movement. This was something else. I glanced down the length of the alley, checking for anyone else. It stretched behind me, narrow and dark. The entrance a pale rectangle of streetlight and falling snow. No figures. No motion, just the impression that the distance between me and the exit was longer than it should have been. I thought about calling out again, louder, asserting myself the way training tells you to. The words sat in my throat and wouldn't arrange themselves. I tried a different approach. I introduced myself. Name. Police department. Simple facts, offered like a lifeline. Nothing. The man's face was close enough now that I could see fine details. The way his eyelashes clumped together with frost. The faint discoloration at the edges of his lips. The stillness of his pupils. They didn't reflect the light the way eyes usually do. They absorbed it. A thought occurred to me then. Uninvited and unwelcome. What if he wasn't facing the wall? What if the wall was facing him? I shook that off immediately. That kind of thinking was a luxury I couldn't afford in the middle of a call. I took another step back, putting more space between us, and waited for backup. The radio clicked softly at my shoulder. A low intermittent sound that didn't quite resolve into static or silence. It felt like a heartbeat, not mine. Minutes stretched. My watch face fogged slightly when I checked it. The numbers blurring. Time seemed thick in the alley, resistant to movement. I became acutely aware of my own body. The ache in my knees. The tightness in my jaw. The way my breath sounded too loud in my ears. Each sensation felt amplified as if the alley was paying attention. I told myself again that this was real. That I was standing behind an abandoned bakery in Detroit on a cold January night, doing my job. That there was a man in front of me who needed help or removal or documentation. I told myself it was real until the words felt thin. Not real. Real. Not real. The sound of approaching tires finally reached me, muffled by snow, but unmistakable. Headlights swept across the mouth of the alley, briefly brightening the space behind me. Relief hit me harder than I expected. A sudden loosening in my chest. I turned, just for a second, to look back toward the street. When I turned back, the man was gone. There was no sound, no movement I could point to, no sense of departure. Just empty space where he had been standing. The frost on the air lingered a moment longer than it should have. I stood there, staring at the blank wall, my flashlight beam trembling slightly now, and felt something settle into place that I couldn't name yet. The alley was listening. And it had heard enough. I stood there longer than I should have. That's another thing the memory keeps circling back to, like it wants to accuse me of something. I should have called it in immediately. I should have secured the area. I should have marked the ground, taken photos, noted the absence of footprints. Those are the actions that give a moment shape. Without them, it stretches. But when the space where the man had been standing emptied itself, my brain stalled. It didn't know what to do with a disappearance that made no sound. The brick wall in front of me was bare, close enough that I could see the individual chips and cracks. The patch where his face had been inches away was lighter, smoother than the surrounding brick, like it had been polished by breath. I stared at it, waiting for my eyes to correct themselves, waiting for the shape of a person to resolve out of shadow the way it sometimes does when you're tired. Nothing moved. The sound of tires outside the alley grew louder, then slowed. Doors opened. Boots hit pavement. Voices carried, muted but familiar. The city reasserting itself inch by inch. I lowered my flashlight and exhaled. I hadn't realized how shallow my breathing had been until then. The cold rushed in, filling the space the tension left behind. 2 officers stepped into the alley, their beams cutting across mine. One of them called my name, his tone already edged with concern. "Where is he?" I turned slowly, gestured toward the empty space in front of the wall. The gesture felt ridiculous even as I made it. "He was right there," I said. The words sounded wrong. Past tense, present space. They exchanged a look. The kind you get used to in this job. The look that says, "We're going to have to figure out how to talk about this." They swept the alley methodically, lights tracing the ground, the walls, the debris. One of them knelt near the entrance, examining the snow. "You see this?" he said. I joined him. There were footprints leading into the alley, staggered, half filled by drifting snow. They ended a few feet in, fading into nothing. No prints leading back out. No scuff marks. No drag lines. Like he just stopped, the other officer said, not finishing the thought. I didn't answer. I was still looking at the wall. They asked me questions. I answered them. Male subject. Approximate height. Clothing description unresponsive. Standing. I repeated the details like they were facts I could pin down. One of them asked if I was sure I hadn't just missed him slipping past. It wasn't accusatory. It was practical. An attempt to restore order. I said I was sure. I didn't add that I'd only turned my back for a second. I didn't add that the alley had felt fuller before he vanished. We stood there for a while longer. The 3 of us. Lights moving. Breath fogging. Waiting for something else to happen. It didn't. Eventually there was nothing left to do but leave. We cleared the call as unfounded. That's the phrase they used. It went into the system with a timestamp and a location and a note that didn't begin to cover it. Unfounded. I drove the rest of my shift on autopilot. The city looked the same as it always did, but something about it felt flatter, like a backdrop that had been left up too long. Every alley I passed seemed deeper than it had before. Every shadow looked like it was paying attention. I went home when my shift ended. My apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually feels earned after a long night. I kicked off my boots, hung my coat, stood in the kitchen with the light on longer than I needed to. When I closed my eyes, I saw the frost on his eyelashes. I told myself I was tired. I told myself my brain was filling in gaps, because that's what it does when it's under pressure. I told myself that the job takes a toll, and sometimes that toll shows up in strange ways. Not real. 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 Not real. I slept badly. Woke up with the sense that someone had been standing in the room with me. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to hear my breathing. The feeling faded when I sat up, leaving behind a dull unease that followed me through the day. At the precinct, the night got folded into routine. Reports, briefings, coffee that tasted like burnt water. A few people asked about the call. Casual curiosity. I gave them the same clean version I'd given everyone else. Guy took off. Probably didn't want to deal with police. Nobody argued. The city is full of people who don't want to be found. But there were things that didn't settle. The dispatcher avoided my eyes when I passed her desk. When I asked her later if she remembered the call, she hesitated before answering. "Yeah," she said. I remember. There was something in her voice then. Not fear. Recognition. That afternoon, I pulled up old incident reports from the same area. It wasn't part of any assignment. I told myself I was just curious. I told myself it was good police work to know your territory. The search took longer than it should have. The system lagged, froze, spat back errors. When it finally loaded, the list was longer than I expected. Welfare checks. Suspicious persons. unfounded reports, all clustered around the same few blocks, same alley, different years. The language varied, but the shape was familiar. Male subject standing, unresponsive, gone upon arrival. One report caught my eye. It was old, typed in a format that marked it as decades out of date. The officer's name wasn't one I recognized. The narrative was brief, restrained. Subject observed standing motionless in alley behind closed bakery. Appeared unaware of officer presence. Upon turning to call for backup, subject no longer present. No tracks observed. At the bottom, in a different hand, there was a note. Officer requested reassignment shortly thereafter. No reason given. I printed the report and folded it into my pocket. The paper felt thin, fragile, like it might dissolve if I looked at it too hard. Over the next few days, small things began to shift. The radio in my car crackled when it shouldn't have. Not full transmissions, just bursts of static that sounded almost like breathing if you listened too long. I checked the wiring. Maintenance checked it. They couldn't find anything wrong. I started noticing people standing still, not in alleys, not in ways that would justify a call, just moments where someone on a corner seemed frozen until you looked away. Mannequins in store windows that felt closer together than before. Reflections that didn't move quite in sync. I told myself this was hypervigilance, a normal response after a strange call. You see patterns where there aren't any. But then, there was the sound. It started one night as I was finishing a report, alone in the squad room. A soft sound, intermittent, like someone clearing their throat in another room. I looked up, expecting to see someone there. The room was empty. The sound came again, faint but unmistakable. A breath. Slow, deliberate. I stood up so quickly my chair scraped loudly against the floor. The sound stopped. I checked the halls, the locker room, the entrance. Nothing. When I went back to my desk, the radio on it was lit up. The channel indicator glowed softly, even though it was switched off. I didn't touch it. I backed away instead, heart pounding, and left the room. That night on my drive home, I passed the alley behind the bakery without meaning to. My route had shifted, just slightly enough to put me there. The street was empty. Snow had fallen again, smoothing everything over. The mouth of the alley looked darker than the surrounding street, like a cut in the city. I slowed down. I didn't turn in. I told myself I didn't need to. That there was nothing there. As I drove past, I glanced in my rearview mirror for just a moment. In the darkness behind me, I thought I saw a shape standing where the alley narrowed. Perfectly still. Facing away. I didn't go back to the alley right away. That's important, because later it will feel like I did. Later, the memory compresses itself, pulls everything toward that place like gravity. But there were days in between, ordinary days, shifts that started and ended, coffee breaks, traffic stops, paperwork, the city continuing to be a city. I clung to that normalcy harder than I realized at the time. I told myself the mirror trick was just that. A trick. Reflections catch on things. Shadows line up. When you're tired, your brain fills in gaps with whatever it's been chewing on. That's not a haunting. That's physiology. Not real. Real. Not real. The phrase started showing up then, quietly, like a mental tick. I didn't say it out loud. I didn't even fully think it. It was more like a rhythm underneath my thoughts. A way of bracing myself when something didn't line up. I kept working nights. I didn't request a change. I didn't mention the alley again unless someone else brought it up, which they didn't. The call had already sunk into the city's backlog of strange but harmless incidents. Except it didn't feel harmless anymore. The first time I noticed I was being careful about where I stood, it surprised me. I found myself positioning my body so my back was always to something solid. A wall. A car. a counter. I avoided open spaces without consciously deciding to. When I caught myself doing it, I laughed it off. Old habits, I told myself. But the city started to feel different around me. Not threatening, not overtly wrong, just watchful. Like it had shifted its attention. Alleyways seemed deeper. Doorways lingered in my peripheral vision. I started noticing how often people pause in between places, standing still for a beat longer than necessary, as if listening for something before moving on. I began checking the radio more often. Not because of calls, but because of the quiet between them. There were stretches where the channel stayed open too long, no chatter, no static, just a low presence that felt like pressure on my ears. One night, dispatch called me by the wrong unit number. She corrected herself immediately, apologized, blamed the system. But the number she used belonged to an officer who'd retired years ago. I remembered him vaguely. Older guy. Quiet. Had a way of watching rooms instead of people. I didn't mention it. Sleep became harder. Not because of nightmares. Those would have been easier to dismiss. It was the waking moments that bothered me. Lying in bed, eyes open, listening to the building settle, I would get the sense that time had slowed down around me. Not stopped, just stretched. I'd check the clock. A minute would pass. Sometimes less. Sometimes more. The numbers seemed unreliable, like they were approximations rather than facts. On my nights off, I tried to distract myself. Television. Music. Cleaning my apartment too thoroughly. Anything that filled the space. But silence crept in anyway, slipping between sounds. In that silence, I started hearing things that weren't quite there. A soft intake of breath, the faintest scuff, like a shoe against brick. Each time I'd hold my own breath without realizing it. Waiting. Nothing would happen. That was almost worse. I went back to the reports. Not officially. I didn't flag anything, didn't open an investigation. I just read. I stayed late after a shift, logged into the system, and followed the thread as far back as it would let me. The pattern widened. Different precincts. Different officers. Same winter months. Same vague descriptions. Always alleys. Always stillness. Always disappearance. In some reports, there were details that hadn't stood out before. A note about radios malfunctioning. A mention of the cold feeling wrong. An observation about time slipping. One report ended abruptly, the narrative trailing off mid-sentence. There was no follow-up. No closure. I printed that one too. I started carrying the papers with me, folded into my jacket pocket. I don't know why. Maybe it made the thing feel contained. Documented. If it was written down, maybe it couldn't move as freely. Not real. Real. Not real. The folklore started to surface in my mind then, uninvited. Things I'd heard over the years and dismissed. Stories about the city that lived in the spaces between official records. There was an old rumor about certain alleys being thinner than others. About places where the noise of the city faded not because there was nothing there, but because something else had learned to listen better. Some people said the city remembered everyone who'd ever waited too long in it. Some said winter made those memories sharper. I didn't believe that. I told myself I didn't. But I found myself avoiding conversations that drifted too close to those topics. I didn't want to hear names for what I was experiencing. Names make things solid. The first time I saw him again, I wasn't looking for him. I was parked at a red light, alone in my car. The street empty in all directions. Snow fell lightly, not enough to matter. The buildings around me were dark, their windows reflecting my headlights back at me. I glanced at my side mirror out of habit. He was standing on the sidewalk behind me. Not close, not far, just there, perfectly still, facing away. My heart slammed hard enough that I felt it in my throat. I twisted in my seat, hand already moving toward the door handle. The sidewalk was empty. I looked back at the mirror. Nothing. I sat there through the light change, through the next cycle, until a car pulled up behind me and honked. I drove on autopilot after that, my hands shaking on the wheel. I told myself it was a coincidence, a reflection, a trick of the glass. Stress manifesting visually. It happens. Except, it kept happening. Not every night. Not predictably. Just enough that I couldn't dismiss it outright. A figure at the end of a block. A shape in a doorway. Always when I wasn't directly looking. Always still. Always turned away. Never close enough to touch. I started taking different routes. I started checking mirrors compulsively. I started arriving early to shifts and leaving late. Lingering in places with other people, other sounds. This city didn't give me much relief. One night, as I was walking from the parking lot to my building, I heard it clearly for the first time. A breath. Not mine. Not close. Somewhere between the buildings, drawn out and slow. Like someone savoring the cold air. I froze, keys clenched in my hand, heart hammering. The sound came again, then stopped. I stood there longer than was reasonable, listening. Nothing else followed. Inside my apartment, I locked the door and leaned against it, feeling foolish and shaken. I told myself I needed rest, time off, distance from whatever had lodged itself in my head. But distance wasn't working. The next shift, I got a call near the end of the night. Not the alley, a different one, a few blocks away. Same kind of report. Suspicious person. Standing. The dispatcher's voice hesitated on the last word, just for a fraction of a second. I stared at the screen in my car, at the address blinking back at me. I could have cleared it. Asked another unit to take it, given any number of reasonable excuses. Instead, I put the car in gear. As I drove, a familiar pressure settled into my chest. The phrase surfaced again. Unbidden, steadying and destabilizing all at once. Not real. Real. Not real. The alley was narrower than the first. Dirtier. The snow back there was untouched. Smooth as a sheet. I stopped at the entrance and turned off my headlights. For a moment I just sat there, listening. The city seemed very far away. And I had the unmistakable feeling that something, somewhere ahead of me, had been waiting for the sound of my engine to disappear. I don't remember deciding to get out of the car. That's not me being dramatic. It's a gap. One moment I was sitting there with my hands on the wheel, engine ticking as it cooled. The alley ahead of me a narrow tunnel of shadow. The next moment I was standing outside, door shut behind me. The cold already biting through my gloves. When I try to replay it, my mind skips like a damaged recording. I stood at the mouth of the alley and listened. No footsteps, no voices, no distant traffic bleeding through. The quiet was immediate and complete, like someone had shut a door behind me without asking. My radio was silent, not even static. I told myself that was good. That meant nothing was wrong. That meant no one else was talking over me. No one else was panicking. I took a step in. The snow here was pristine. No footprints, no tire tracks, just a smooth, pale surface stretching ahead, broken only by scattered debris frozen in place. A bottle half buried in ice, a piece of cardboard stiff as wood. The walls leaned inward slightly, brick dark with moisture. My flashlight beam traced them automatically, a habit I couldn't turn off. Halfway down, I stopped. There was a man standing near the far end of the alley. He wasn't in the same position as before. This one faced sideways, his profile turned toward the wall, like he'd been interrupted mid-thought and simply paused. His coat hung open, unmoving. His hands were visible, empty. He stood on the snow without sinking into it. That detail hit me harder than the rest. I waited for my mind to argue with what I was seeing, for the rational explanations to line up and present themselves. They didn't. Not real. Real. Not real. I called out. The words automatic. Hollow. Sir. Police. No response. I advanced slowly, counting my steps without meaning to. My flashlight beam shook, then steadied. The man's face came into clearer view. It wasn't the same face. That was the first thing I noticed. Different nose. Different hairline. Younger, maybe. Or older. It was hard to tell. His eyes were open, unfocused, staring at nothing. His expression was neutral, almost peaceful. But the stillness was the same. The wrongness was the same. The frost was the same, gathered along the edges of his clothes, tracing his outline like a border. I felt a surge of something close to relief. It wasn't him. That meant it wasn't following me. That meant... The thought cut off as soon as it formed. Because if it wasn't him, then it was something else. I stopped a few feet away, my boots finally sinking slightly into the snow. I could see my own prints behind me now, a trail that proved I had moved. That time was behaving itself in some small way. I glanced back once, a quick check of the alley entrance. It looked farther away than it should have been. When I turned back, the man had shifted. Not stepped. Not turned. Shifted. His head was angled differently now. Just enough that his gaze brushed past me instead of through me. The change was subtle, but unmistakable. Like a clock hand jumping forward when you weren't watching. My heart pounded hard enough to make my vision pulse. I hadn't heard him move. I hadn't blinked. I backed up a step. Then another. He didn't follow. He didn't need to. The air in the alley felt thicker, harder to draw into my lungs. Each breath sounded too loud in my ears, as if the space was amplifying it, memorizing it. I tried the radio. Pressed the button, said my unit number. Nothing. Not even static. I lowered my hand slowly, the radio suddenly heavy and useless. The man breathed. Once. The sound was wrong. Too deep. Too deliberate. It echoed off the walls in a way that didn't make sense, as if the alley was longer than it looked. I realized then that he wasn't cold. The frost clung to him, but it didn't affect him. His posture didn't sag. His muscles didn't tremble. He stood like the temperature was irrelevant. Like time was irrelevant. I thought of the reports, of the smooth patch on the brick wall behind the bakery, of officers requesting reassignment without explanation. I thought of the way the city seemed to hold its breath around certain places. Listening alley. I took another step back, my heel catching on something hard beneath the snow. I stumbled, windmilling for balance, and for a split second my eyes dropped to the ground. When I looked up again, the man was closer. Not by much, but enough. I froze. My body refused to obey the command to move. My muscles locked, as if they'd decided that stillness was safer than action. The man tilted his head. The motion was slow, precise, like it had been practiced. His lips parted. I waited for words. None came. Instead, he inhaled again, deeper this time, and I felt it in my chest. A pulling sensation, like my breath wanted to follow his out of my body. Not real. Real. Not real. The phrase ran through my head faster now, overlapping itself, losing its rhythm. My vision narrowed. The edges of the alley blurred. The only thing in sharp focus was the man's face, his eyes reflecting my flashlight beam dully. I don't know how long we stood like that. Time didn't behave normally in that space. Seconds stretched. Minutes collapsed. The concept of duration felt meaningless. What broke it was a sound. Footsteps. Distant. Muffled. Real. Somewhere beyond the mouth of the alley, someone was moving. Another unit. A civilian. Anyone. The man's head snapped back to its original position. The movement was sudden enough to make me gasp. For the first time since I'd arrived, he did something unmistakably reactive. He was listening. The footsteps grew louder. I felt a release in my chest, like a knot loosening. My muscles unlocked all at once, and I stumbled back another step, nearly falling. The man didn't move again. He didn't have to. The presence in the alley shifted, like attention being withdrawn. I didn't wait. I turned and walked, then jogged, then ran back toward the entrance, my boots slipping on the snow. I didn't look back. I couldn't risk seeing him closer. The mouth of the alley spilled me back onto the street, the city's noise crashing in all at once. A car passed. A door slammed somewhere. A radio squawked. Another patrol car pulled up just as I reached the sidewalk. The officer inside rolled down his window, eyebrow raised. "You good?" he asked. I nodded too quickly, too hard. "Yeah." False alarm. The words tasted like ash. He glanced past me into the alley. I followed his gaze despite myself. It was empty. Perfectly empty. No man, no disturbed snow beyond my own chaotic footprints, no sign that anything had been standing there at all. The other officer shrugged, pulled away. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the alley, my heart still racing. I knew then that it wasn't one man, it was a pattern. And I was part of it now. After that night, I stopped pretending I was still on the outside of it. That's the cleanest way I can say it. Something had crossed a line, or maybe I had. Either way, the distance I'd been trying to maintain collapsed. The city no longer felt like a place I moved through. It felt like a system I was inside of, one that had started to account for me. I didn't file a report about the second alley. I didn't mention the missing man, the radio silence, the way my body had refused to move. There was no version of that story that fit into the forms we used. Writing it down would have made it real in a way I wasn't ready for. Not real. Real. Not real. The phrase had stopped being a reassurance. It was more like a diagnostic now, something I repeated to check whether my thoughts still belonged to me. I started noticing the waiting. That's the only word that fits. Not following. Not stalking. Waiting. In parking lots, I'd catch sight of someone standing near the edge of the light, motionless, and feel a spike of panic before they shifted their weight, or raised a phone or did something ordinary. The relief would come too fast, too intense. Like my body was overreacting to threats that hadn't fully arrived yet. But sometimes, they didn't move. Those moments were brief. A second or two at most, long enough for the wrongness to register, not long enough to confirm it. I learned to look away quickly. The radio incidents increased. Not full malfunctions, not anything that would justify pulling the unit from service. Just small disruptions. A channel opening on its own. A burst of static that resolved into nothing. Once, very late in a shift, I heard breathing over the speaker. Slow. Even. I shut it off and drove the rest of the night in silence. Sleep became something I endured rather than sought. When I did drift off, it was shallow and fragmented. I'd wake with the sense that time had slipped, that I'd missed something important by closing my eyes. I started leaving lights on. The hallway. The kitchen. I told myself it was because the winter days were short, and the apartment felt dark. The truth was simpler. Darkness had begun to feel like an invitation. One evening, I found frost on the inside of my window. The heating was working fine. The rest of the glass was clear. Just one patch, oval-shaped, near where my head would be if I stood close and looked out. I scraped it away with my fingernail. The glass underneath was smooth, unmarked. I didn't sleep that night. At work, I began to feel watched in a way that wasn't paranoid exactly. It wasn't that I thought people were observing me. It was the sense that spaces were. The locker room felt too quiet when I was alone in it. The evidence room made my chest tighten. Hallways seemed longer, emptier, their endpoints less certain. I tried to talk to someone about it. Not directly. I asked questions instead, casual ones. I brought up old stories, half joking about strange calls and unfounded reports. I watched faces carefully, listened for hesitation. Most people laughed it off. One didn't. He was older, nearing retirement, someone who'd been on nights longer than most. When I mentioned the alley behind the bakery, his expression changed. Just slightly. He didn't ask why I was bringing it up. He didn't ask what I'd seen. He said, very quietly, "Did it move when you weren't looking at it?" The question landed hard. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure how. He nodded to himself, as if my silence was enough. "They don't like to be interrupted," he said. He paused, then added, "Or maybe they do. Hard to tell." I asked him what he meant. He shook his head. "Not here." That was the end of the conversation. After that, the waiting felt closer. I'd catch myself standing still for no reason. In my kitchen, in the locker room, on the sidewalk outside my building, just pausing, listening, my body going quiet on its own. The first time it happened, I laughed and shook it off. The second time, it took effort to move again. I started to worry about winter. It had always been my favorite season. The quiet, the way the city simplified itself, the way snow covered things without fixing them. Now, each drop in temperature felt like a tightening. One night, driving home after a late shift, I took a wrong turn. Not a dramatic one, just a missed signal, a habitual route disrupted. By the time I realized it, I was already heading down a street I didn't usually take. The bakery was at the end of it. I slowed, heart pounding, telling myself I could turn around. There was nothing forcing me forward. The alley was dark, empty. Snow fell lightly, catching in my headlights. I stopped anyway. I don't know what I expected to see. Another man. The same man. Nothing. The engine idled. The sound felt intrusive. I turned it off. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. No distant traffic. No hum of the city. Just the faint whisper of snow hitting snow. I sat there with my hands in my lap, staring at the mouth of the alley. Minutes passed. Or seconds. It was hard to tell. I felt something then. A subtle shift. Like pressure changing. Like a room filling with people who weren't making noise. I opened the car door. Cold rushed in, sharp and clean. I stood, my legs stiff, and stepped toward the alley. Each footstep sounded louder than the last. The snow inside was untouched. Perfect. I didn't go far, just a few steps. Enough to feel the walls close in, the space narrow. I stopped. Nothing stood in front of me. But the sense of being observed was overwhelming now. Not from behind, not from the side, from the wall. I raised my flashlight, my hand shaking despite myself, and swept the beam across the brick. There it was, the smooth patch, larger than I remembered, wider, taller, the outline not of a person, but of many, overlapping, worn into the wall by time and proximity, by waiting. I felt dizzy. The world tilted slightly, then steadied. A sound came from behind me. Not footsteps. Breathing. Slow. Measured. Close. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Every instinct screamed at me to keep my eyes forward, to maintain whatever fragile boundary my attention created. The breathing continued, matching my own without my consent. Not real. Real. Not real. My legs trembled. The cold seeped upward, past my boots, past my knees. I had the sudden, overwhelming sense that if I stood there long enough, I wouldn't need to make a decision. Something else would make it for me. And that thought felt like relief. I don't know how I got back to my car. That stretch of time resists memory in a way that feels deliberate. Not blank. Curated. like something went through and removed only the parts it didn't want me to keep. I remember standing in the alley, facing the wall, the smooth brick pale in my flashlight beam. I remember the breathing behind me, close enough that the rhythm of it pressed against my thoughts. And then the next clear memory is my hands on the steering wheel, knuckles white, the engine running, the alley shrinking in the rearview mirror. No sense of transition, no decision, just relocation. I drove for a long time after that, past my usual routes, past neighborhoods I didn't recognize right away. The city felt unfamiliar, rearranged, like a map that had been folded differently. Street signs blurred past, red lights came and went. I stopped checking them. At some point, I realized I was repeating a phrase under my breath. Not real. Real. Not real. I didn't remember starting. The words felt necessary, like blinking or swallowing. When I tried to stop, my chest tightened, and a low panic set in until I let them resume. The phrase smoothed something out inside me, even as it made everything else feel less solid. I called in sick the next day. Then the day after that. I stopped answering messages from work. At first, they were concerned, then annoyed, then sparse. The city has a way of moving on when you stop keeping pace with it. Inside my apartment, time thickened. Day and night lost their edges. I slept in short bursts, never long enough to feel rested, waking with the sense that I'd been standing somewhere else, just moments before. Sometimes, when I woke, my feet were cold. I started finding frost in places it didn't belong, along the edge of the bathtub, on the inside of the front door. Once, on the radio I'd taken home from my car, its surface rimmed with white, delicate and precise. I hadn't plugged it in. I moved it to a drawer. That didn't help. The drawer was cold when I opened it later, the metal rails biting into my fingers. I stopped going out unless I had to. When I did, I moved quickly, eyes down, avoiding reflective surfaces, avoiding open spaces where I might stop without meaning to. The waiting pressed closer. I could feel it in my muscles, a tension that wasn't quite fear, more like anticipation, like my body was preparing for a posture it hadn't assumed yet. Standing. Still. I tried to distract myself with research, old newspapers, archived reports, anything that gave me the sense that this had a beginning, and therefore might have an end. What I found instead were gaps, missing persons who were never officially linked, officers who transferred suddenly, retired early, disappeared from records, calls logged and cleared without follow-up. And always winter. Always cold. Always places where people paused on their way to somewhere else. I found a reference in a local history forum, buried deep in a thread about abandoned buildings. Someone mentioned the alley behind the old bakery, called it a dead spot, said radios always cut out there, said sound behaves strangely. One reply stood out. "It's not dead," the user wrote. "It's just listening." The account had been deleted. The waiting began to intrude on my thoughts more aggressively after that. I'd be washing dishes and realize I'd stopped moving, sponge hovering over a plate, water running cold over my hands. I'd be brushing my teeth and catch my reflection standing too straight, too still, my eyes unfocused. Each time it took effort to break the posture, to remind my body that motion was still an option. Not real. Real. Not real. One night the power went out. Not a blackout, just my apartment. The lights flickered once, and died. The city outside continued uninterrupted, windows glowing, streetlights humming. I stood in the sudden dark, heart pounding, listening. The silence that followed was different from the others. Thicker. Expectant. I didn't move. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough for the cold to seep into my feet. Long enough for my breathing to slow. In the darkness, I became acutely aware of my posture. The way my weight was distributed evenly. The way my arms hung at my sides, It felt right. That realization scared me more than anything else had. I forced myself to move, stumbling toward the couch, collapsing onto it, breaking the spell. The power came back minutes later, as if nothing had happened. I laughed then. A short, sharp sound that startled me with its volume. I told myself I was losing it. That thought should have been grounding. It wasn't. It felt like permission. The radio turned on by itself the next night. I was sitting on the floor, back against the couch, lights on, trying to stay awake. The click was soft but unmistakable. The channel indicator glowed. I didn't touch it. At first there was nothing but static. Then the static thinned, resolving into something almost like wind moving through a narrow space. Then breathing. Slow. Measured. Familiar. My own breath began to sync with it before I could stop it. Inhale. Exhale. Inhale. The room felt smaller. The walls closer. A voice came through the speaker. Not a word. A sound. The sound of someone standing very close to a wall, breathing against it. I covered my ears, but the sound didn't stop. It felt internal, resonating somewhere behind my eyes. Images flooded my mind unbidden. The smooth brick. The frost. The way the alley narrowed, focused. The sense of purpose. I realized then what the waiting was for. It wasn't waiting to take me. It was waiting for me to stop resisting. The radio went silent abruptly, plunging the room into an oppressive quiet. My ears rang. I sat there for a long time afterward, shaking, the phrase looping in my head without rhythm now. Not real. Real. Not real. I don't know when I started writing this down. The pages just appeared on my table one morning, my handwriting uneven but unmistakable. Details I didn't remember recording stared back at me, accurate and precise. Times, dates, temperatures, observations about posture, about breath, about how long someone can stand before it stops feeling like an effort. That's when I understood what this account really was. Not a warning, not a confession. A record. Something meant to be found after I was done using it. I can feel the stillness settling into me more easily now. My joints ache less when I don't move. The cold doesn't bother me the way it used to. Sometimes I stand in my kitchen and forget why I went there. Sometimes I stand in the hallway and lose track of which door leads outside. The city feels very quiet lately. Attentive. I think winter is coming back soon. I don't know what day it is. The calendar on the wall still shows a month that doesn't feel correct anymore. I keep meaning to change it, but the act of reaching for it feels unnecessary. Time isn't moving the way it's supposed to, and I don't think it cares what I call it. It's cold tonight. That shouldn't matter. I've lived through colder. But this cold is different. It doesn't press in from the outside. It settles. It arranges itself inside my joints, behind my eyes, along my spine. It feels deliberate, like it's finding the right places to rest. I haven't been to work in a long time. I stopped counting the messages when they stopped sounding concerned. My phone still lights up sometimes, screen glowing on the table where I left it, but I don't pick it up anymore. The vibration feels intrusive, like a reminder of something I'm already stepping away from. The radio is on again. I didn't turn it on. It sits on the counter, angled slightly toward the wall, speaker humming softly. No static. No voices. Just that low presence, like a held breath. Every so often it clicks, the way it did in my car, the way it did in the alley when the city felt far away. I stand across from it, hands at my sides, listening. The kitchen light flickers. I don't look at it. I don't need to. The room feels complete without my attention. I've been standing like this for a while now, long enough that my legs have stopped complaining. Long enough that the ache has faded into something dull and manageable. Long enough that the idea of sitting down feels strange, Impractical. Not real. Real. Not real. The phrase doesn't come as often anymore. When it does, it feels thin, like an echo of something that used to matter. I don't need it as much as I used to. Things are simpler now. The city outside is quiet. Not asleep. Just paused. Through the window I can see the streetlight casting a pale circle onto the snow. It hasn't been disturbed. No footprints, no tire tracks. The world looks untouched, waiting for something to break the surface. I wonder how many nights I've stood like this, facing the same wall, listening to the same quiet. The memory doesn't arrange itself chronologically anymore. It layers instead. Moments overlapping, repeating, wearing each other smooth. The wall in front of me has changed. I didn't notice at first. It happens gradually, like all the important things. The paint has dulled in one spot, right at the level of my face. The texture there is softer, less defined. When I lean closer, the surface feels warmer than the rest of the room. I don't remember touching it before. The radio exhales. That's the only way I can describe the sound. A slow release, drawn out, content. It matches my own breathing without effort. In. Out. In. I think about the alley, not as a place I went to, but as a posture, a narrowing, a way of standing that focuses the world down to what's directly in front of you and what's directly behind. I understand it better now. Understanding doesn't feel like relief. It feels like alignment. There are things I don't need anymore. The badge, for one. I found it in a drawer earlier, cold to the touch, heavier than it should have been. I set it down somewhere and didn't bother to remember where. Symbols lose their usefulness when the role changes. I can hear footsteps sometimes, not in the apartment, not outside the door, somewhere farther away, muffled, approaching then receding. I recognize the sound. Boots on snow. Hesitation at the mouth of a narrow space. Each time it happens, something in me stills further. I don't turn around when I hear the breathing behind me now. There's no need. I know what it means. I know what comes next. The city has always needed places to pause. Places where sound gathers, where time thins out. Where someone stands long enough to learn the shape of the quiet. I think that's what I was always good at. Standing, watching, listening. The radio clicks again. For a moment, just a moment, I consider writing more. Explaining, warning, trying to reach back toward the noise and motion and warmth of before. The thought passes. There's nothing left to explain that wouldn't interfere. The wall in front of me feels closer now. Or maybe I've moved. It's hard to tell. The difference doesn't matter. I stand. I listen. The breath behind me slows. The room feels very full.